Demilitarisation and no role for Hamas and other factions in the future governance of Gaza. That's part of US President Donald Trump's 20-point plan, which led to the ceasefire deal. So what's next for the Palestinian resistance movements? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. US President Donald Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza means there's no future role for Hamas and other armed factions in governing the Strip. Palestinian resistance movements have fought the occupation since their lands were first taken by Israeli and Zionist settlers. But decades since what the Palestinians call the Nakba, or the catastrophe, illegal occupation and violent Israeli oppression have intensified in both the occupied West Bank and in Gaza with the war and the genocide. In history, armed groups, including Israeli Zionists, have transitioned into politics, like the ANC in South Africa, the Kosovo Liberation Army and the IRA in Ireland. So what's next for the Palestine resistance movements? And what lessons can be learned from other conflicts? And what happens if there's no meaningful political pathway for Palestinians and the new generation who have endured Israel's occupation and genocide? We'll discuss all of this with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Ferdy Akar.
An uneasy peace in Gaza as the US brokered ceasefire takes hold. The deal to end fighting also demands Hamas completely disarm under a yet-to-be-agreed framework and effectively disband forever. During such an apparent power vacuum, the Gaza Strip is meant to be governed by technocrats and only handed over to the Palestinian Authority that governs the occupied West Bank if and when it goes through mandated reforms. The deal leaves the future of Palestinian representation and resistance as uncertain as it's ever been. Since the collapse of the Oslo peace process in late 2000, Israel has always sought to portray any armed resistance by Palestinians as illegitimate. Yet, the right to resist foreign occupation and pursue self-determination is enshrined in international law. And around the world, many armed groups have evolved to become mainstream political organisations. 3 decades of conflict ended in Northern Ireland with a 1998 peace deal that saw the political wing of the Irish Republican Army, Sinn Féin, enter the power-sharing Northern Ireland executive. The party is now the largest in the region's parliament, is Ireland's main opposition party, and also holds seats in the UK's parliament in Westminster, which it boycotts. And in South Africa, the African National Congress that fought an armed struggle against the apartheid regime has been in government since 1994. For decades, Western powers adopted the apartheid government's stance that the ANC was a terrorist organisation. When Nelson Mandela, the first president of South Africa to be elected in a fully representative democracy, died in 2013, Western leaders flocked to his funeral, hailing him as a liberator.
"I am not a saint," he said, "unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying."
Yet, unlike Northern Ireland, where adversaries eventually negotiated a political compromise, Palestinians face a far-right Israeli government, vehemently opposed to concessions and the creation of a Palestinian state. And unlike the former apartheid government in South Africa, Western allies continue to support and arm Israel, despite its illegal occupation and settlements in the West Bank and the genocide in Gaza. The final stage of the US 20-point peace plan aims to establish talks between Israel and Palestinians on how to achieve a peaceful coexistence. But the conditions that made peace possible in other conflicts are not present in this one, and the outcome is more unpredictable. Ferdy Akar, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In Copenhagen, Mohammed Shehada is an analyst from Gaza and a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. In London, Andreas Krieg is an associate professor at the School of Security Studies, King's College, London. And in Johannesburg, we have Ronnie Kasrils, a leading anti-apartheid activist, former guerrilla and military commander, and former South African Minister for Intelligence Services. A warm welcome to you all. I want to start with you, Mohammed. The British called them Jewish terrorists, but eventually they did become the state of Israel. People like Yitzhak Shamir, people like Menachem Begin became statesmen. Others became senior politicians within the state of Israel. But this 20-point plan doesn't afford that opportunity to any of the Palestinian resistance movements, including Hamas, which it wants to disband. So there's a hypocrisy going on here. Before we get into the security, the future of all of the Palestinian resistance factions, is this, do you think, designed to kill Palestinian resistance movements?
Yes, absolutely. There are two things that are here catastrophically wrong. Number one is the policy of choosing partners, conferring legitimacy on the people that Western powers like and denying it to others that they don't like. When it comes to Israel, for example, you didn't have a single Western country that said, let's boycott Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir or Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin, although both of them were internationally wanted terrorists for having British blood on their hands. And with Begin, his party Harut, that gave birth to the Likud party today, was considered in Israel as a Nazi party by Einstein. David Ben-Gurion called Begin a Hitleristic type. But you didn't have this policy of pick and choose which good Israelis are the ones we're going to deal with and which others are we going to boycott. The other thing is that traditionally in any peace agreement that had an element of disarmament or demilitarization or decommissioning, the decommissioning part came as the outcome of the peace agreement, not the prerequisite. What that means is that in Northern Ireland, you had the Good Friday Agreement signed in 1998. It took until 2007 for the IRA to decommission their weapons, nine years later. It took even longer for the loyalists to decommission their weapons. It took until, I think, about 2009, 2010. In the case of Hamas, what you have is the international community and Israel articulating that Trump deal, telling the Palestinians that you need to lay down your arms, you need to prove to us that you are very good, perfect victims in order for us to consider whether or not you are worthy of your basic rights. That's not how peacemaking works, especially when it comes to an army.
It's a very interesting point you make. I'm going to bring in Andreas Krieg here. Andreas, you have studied conflicts coming to an end. You've advised militaries on strategies when it comes to both ending conflicts and strategies within conflicts. But here, this is slightly different, isn't it? This is a 20-point plan that didn't have any Palestinian input that was imposed on the Palestinians themselves. This does not set the stage for a lasting peace, does it?
No, absolutely not. And I think if you were to compare this to other conflicts that have ended where we had a negotiated settlement, there were a couple of other criteria that were met before we entered into the stage of demilitarization, demobilization, disarmament and reintegration. And security sector reform and rebuilding governance, all these things that are now supposed to come. I think this plan is deliberately ambiguous. I mean, 20 points to end a conflict, which is probably the most protracted conflict in modern history, at least, is obviously insufficient. So there's a lot of blanks that need to be filled in. There are a lot of details that need to be filled in. I think we're now at a first stage of a much wider sort of negotiation. And I think nobody's blue-eyed to think that this is the final outcome and that everything will be delivered as it is outlined in these 20 points. Every single step will have to be negotiated. I mean, the criteria that we're missing here is, number one, there isn't a mutually hurting stalemate. I think that is a very important prerequisite for both parties willingly coming to the negotiation table. The Israeli public is still, whether you want to agree with it or not, the sentiment of victimhood that they have, the sentiment of fear, the trauma of the 7th of October is widespread. So just to say that this is only 20 or 30% of Israeli public that feels that way is kind of underestimating how Israelis feel about it. And the majority of Israelis don't want peace. They don't want a Palestinian state. The second thing is we don't have leadership on both sides, certainly not on the Israeli side, where there is very clear that even if Netanyahu was not to be re-elected, anyone else who's coming will probably go down on the same trajectory. On the Palestinian side, we have a legitimacy issue as well. I mean, we need elections. We need to have a leadership that can actually represent the Palestinian people. The third element is that we have not an international community that actually can guarantee guarantee that whatever is agreed at the negotiation table will be adhered to. And we need people to twist arms. And I'm not sure Trump is the guy who will have the sort of strategic patience to keep on twisting arms, particularly of Netanyahu, to deliver on this. And finally, we have a lot of spoilers, extremists on both sides, who are unwilling to, just concede and are outside of that Venn diagram that has been created over the last couple of weeks. So I think we need to be a bit more patient as we move into the next phase.
Let's bring in Ronnie here and the lesson from South Africa. Extremists on both sides is what Andreas said. There was at one point where no one thought apartheid would end. No one thought that there would be something called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. No one thought there would be elections in South Africa that were representative. All of those things happened eventually, but the conditions were there. The conditions aren't right, do you think, with the Palestinians and the Israelis? And what can they do? What lessons can they take from South Africa to get to that point?
Yes, it's very far from that stage, totally. It's colonial, imperialist imposition on the Palestinian people at the point of the gun. And we've seen what that's really meant in terms of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on. It's an imposition, and the Palestinians have had to react in a way to move forward. In South Africa, so they forced into this do or die, and they've got no real choice. So it's an extreme. It's not real. In South Africa, the situation had reached a stage where the regime was forced to concede and to turn to some solution after huge delays and refusal for real negotiation. So what we had when it came to the point of the breakthrough was the strength of the people on the ground, the fact of the international community at that time adhering to United Nations positions and sanctions, the BDS movement reinforcing the struggle of the people of South Africa, and the regime could not just continue. The problem in relation to the Palestinian situation is that the arch-imperialist, the USA, is fully behind the illegal apartheid Israeli Zionist and colonial settled regime. And
Ronnie, I'm going to come back to that.
Point.
I'm going to come back to this point with you in just a second, Ronnie, because I want to put it to our other guests as well. Palestine stands alone in the world, Mohammed. It doesn't have the kind of backing that it needs, simply because, as Ronnie pointed out, as we all know, the US is its effective lawyer when it comes to all of that. But even in this 20-point plan, there was no Palestinian consultation. There was no Palestinians involved in drafting this. And that's being laid bare as the plan unfolds, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were also no American civil servants consulted in this. It's the way that things are done in the White House at the moment under President Trump is basically, it's all about their gut feeling, their intuition. They think that they can run this as a business stunt. So it was basically Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, Tony Blair, and Trump cooking together this plan. And basically you had Arab countries that tried to add their input to it. The earlier version of the plan was somewhat okay. It was terrible in many aspects, but it could have been lived with. It spoke not of demilitarization or disarmament. It spoke of decommissioning Hamas's offensive weaponry only. Offensive means the rockets. And Hamas already doesn't have any of these left. So basically it would have been very easy to live by this. Then you had Netanyahu sit down for 6 hours with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and change that plan beyond recognition. Not a single Arab or Muslim country that saw that plan afterwards remained committed to it. All of them behind the scenes were very devastated about the changes that Netanyahu introduced. And they were introduced on purpose to be a non-starter for any Palestinian to accept, to say yes to this plan. That's why you ended up with a Hamas response that said, yes, We welcome the Trump plan's element on ending the war, ending the genocide. We welcome it on the idea of withdrawal from Gaza and the prisoner swap. The rest of the plan we can deal with later as a Palestinian national movement, not as Hamas on its own, which was a clever way of deferring and delaying the problematic parts of the plan and hoping that Arab countries, Turkey as well, might be able to talk some sense
Mohammed,
to the Trump
let's talk about those problematic, as you describe them, parts of the plan. Andreas, is this 20-point plan designed to fail and fail in Israel's favour?
As it stands right now, it's not a plan for peace. It's a dictate. And it's a dictate, as Mohammed just rightly said, that was kind of pushed down the throat of Hamas negotiators, and there wasn't a way out. I think Arab and Muslim countries have realized, and Qatar as a mediator as well, they realized that we need to now get to a stage of a ceasefire first. That was the primary goal of this, and then obviously exchange of hostages. That was that, and obviously getting aid in. These were the kind of pressing issues, and stopping the atrocities on the ground. That was the primary issue. That was achieved. This is not a peace plan that will build lasting peace between Gaza and Israel, or Palestine and Israel, or going down towards a two-state solution. It was never meant to do that. I think this is a first step, and anybody who thinks that this could be translated into an effective integration of Palestinians into self-governance, they'd be blue-eyed. I think the biggest problem is the root cause of the insurgency, and I think this is a framing issue. I mean, terrorism and the label of terrorism is something that we throw around politically. It's a political trope. It's when we look at the efficiency of how we get to the next stage of peace and more lasting peace in Gaza, we need to look at this as an insurgency. And the insurgency is much bigger than Hamas, and it's much bigger. The idea of resistance is so much bigger than the militant wings on the ground. And the root causes of that insurgency, the grievances of this insurgency, they persist, and they're not being addressed at all in this peace plan. And so to think that this will now lead to all of the militants to surrender their weapons and there will be peace ever after is obviously an illusion. And we will get to the next stage where I think Arab mediators will have to then ask the tough questions to Trump of how realistic it will be to get to phase 2, 3 and whatnot of this plan. As it stands right now, this is just to make sure we get to some ceasefire.
Ronnie, I'll come to you in a second, but I want to pick up that point with Mohammed. Mohammed, there are a generation of young kids who have just been through a genocide. A generation of young kids that have been scarred by this. There was a generation of Palestinians that went through the Intifada that wanted to fight back. This is worse than that. So like Andreas says, there is going to be the need for resistance. This doesn't address that. It doesn't address what Palestine will look like politically. So where is this for the future? Let's take away Hamas. Let's not worry about the other armed factions. What does this mean for ordinary Palestinians growing up? They're 5, 6 years old now. They're going to be 15, 16 in 10 years' time. What does it mean for them?
Well, basically, it can go either one of two ways. Number one is basically that Israel's genocide, preceded by numerous atrocities, were the most radicalizing element that pushed people into Hamas's arms in the first place. It's not the appeal of violence that is attracting Palestinians to armed resistance. It's rather Israel's crushing, foiling the alternative options, diplomacy, nonviolence, advocacy, legal pursuit, and the international community betraying all of it with complete silence and complicity that led Palestinians towards that path. So the people that burst the gates of Gaza at the beginning of this war were actually the children that lived through Israel's Operation Protective Edge, Israel's Operation Cast Lead, and Pillar of Defense. In Gaza, people measure their age by how many wars they have survived. I personally survived 10 Israeli military operations, 3 wars, and 2 grand invasions. So the more Israel keeps trying this military option, the more they are creating resentment, the more they are creating resistance and blowback in return. The other way that it can go is basically the way it went with the anticipation of peace when the Oslo Accords were signed. Of course, it went sideways at the time, but when the expectation was there on the day that it was signed, you had basically children in Gaza. The people of Gaza turned to IDF soldiers with flowers, and they wanted to let bygones be bygones and look forward. The problem is that you do not have a single Israeli politician in the mainstream that is willing to talk about a two-state solution at the moment. Not even the very Israeli left-wing Meretz Labor. Israel's Yair Golan, the head of that party, is saying that the two-state solution is not going to happen anytime soon. It is considered today a political suicide in Israel to mention that you support peace with Palestinians, that you support the two-state solution. So that leaves us with a very ugly way.
I want to come back to Ronnie now. Ronnie, you were the Minister for Intelligence Services for South Africa at a very crucial time. If this 20-point plan was presented to you at the time, would you have taken it seriously? Would you have said, OK, this is a government that is serious about peace?
No, absolutely not. And various approaches were made to Nelson Mandela and the other leaders in prison pre the breakthrough. They were all rejected. Mandela had to renounce the armed struggle. He had to accept going to be parked off in Bantustan and so on. It was only when the regime, under pressure from the people and the global community, came to the point of realization that there couldn't be peace without justice, and they were confronted with this incredible upsurge from the masses and the economic ruling power and trading partners with South Africa applied pressure. So this came from all angles. That's when the breakthrough occurred. So we would have rejected this outright. I'm not blaming the Palestinian people. They're really up against the execution, and we never faced that in terms of that breakthrough in South Africa. And we come back to the point that the key difference is that Donald Trump and US imperialism is hand and glove in league with Netanyahu and his ilk. And that's why they are pronouncing this 20-point plan, which, as the other speakers have said, is absolutely unacceptable. One can accept and understand.
Sorry, Ronnie, we are running out of time, and so I'm going to come to. I want to come to Andreas. Andreas, I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Mohammed at the very top of this program. Is this designed to kill Palestinian resistance movements? Is that the future for the Palestinian resistance movements?
No, I don't. I mean, it's intended to do that. I mean, this is coming about by three people in the United States who know very little about the Middle East, so not surprising, and have only ever been filtered a version of the Middle East that was kind of dictated and narrated by Israel. So it's not going to break the resistance, I'm afraid, unless we have steps. You know, we need justice, we need reconciliation, we need Palestinian self-determination, and that was what the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, all the Muslim countries were advocating for, that there is a clear pathway to Palestinian statehood. And even that could be disrupted. But even the mention of Palestinian statehood is not in this 20-point plan. So, you know, as we don't have that, I can't see how the root cause of resistance is going to be broken. And by the way, not just in Gaza. I mean, Hamas and the idea of resistance is much bigger than Gaza. It goes into the West Bank, but it also has a global diaspora behind it as well. So I think breaking that movement, even if the organization is broken of Hamas, the movement, the idea is still there. And unless we have an actual credible pathway to self-determination for the Palestinian people, we will not have the end of resistance.
Mohammed, the language used by the 20-point plan is the United States will establish a dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians to agree on a political horizon for peaceful and prosperous coexistence. That is not the language of either lawyers. That's not the language, as you pointed out earlier, of civil servants. This is language that's easily not adhered to because it's frankly wishy-washy. That's, you think, is deliberate. But what does that mean if you're Hamas, if you're Fatah, if you're part of the PLO? What does that language mean for those guys, the resistance, as it were?
Well, as you said, the language is completely meaningless. It's supposed to be there to sort of like woo Arab audiences, especially the Abraham Accords crowd, into believing that this plan is offering something while offering absolutely nothing. I've heard from Arab mediators describing this plan as neither a plan nor a framework. They said it's a political performance meant to further legitimize Israel's violence, structural violence against Palestinians. What you have there was an earlier version of that Trump plan that spoke of the need for de-radicalizing the Israeli public. That reference was removed altogether when Netanyahu sat with Witkoff and Kushner. Now you're left basically with saying that Gaza is the one that needs to be de-radicalized, terror-free zone, without any mention of what we see. Most of the evidence of genocide comes basically from an average Israeli soldier in Gaza filming with their own mobile devices, posting it on social media to brag and relish in the murder, the crimes that they commit on the ground. But what you have here is basically, without this pathway to Palestinian statehood, it's impossible to ask Palestinians to put their arms down. Even if you squeeze Hamas's leadership in Doha into agreeing into this kind of concession, the members on the ground, the individual militants with the weapons, you need to convince them to hand over these weapons, and they would not hand it over without a pathway that leads to their basic freedom. And you're not offering any of this in this current Trump plan, in its current form. It just says, hand over the weapons, pledge your eternal submission to Israel, and trust that Israel would be kind to you, or they will at least consider being kind to you without any prospect of gaining the basic freedom that you require as any human being.
Just very quickly, Andreas, you've been listening to what our guests have been saying. Here's the deal. You have an insurgency, right? That's how you described it earlier. This is an insurgency. Insurgencies are incredibly difficult to defeat because they come from the people. The people weren't consulted on this plan. The people aren't part of this 20-point plan. So this is designed completely to fail.
Well, the biggest problem that we have, and the Israelis have tried to redefine 30 years of counterinsurgency strategy, policy, and sort of research in the West, and we didn't do a great job in Iraq and Afghanistan as collectively as the West. But the idea is obviously it's about hearts and minds, right? We look at an insurgency as an iceberg, where only the tip of the iceberg is the militant element. The bigger part of the iceberg that we don't see is the popular support. And if you don't aim there to actually win people over, you're never going to win the insurgency. The Israelis have tried with an iron fist to just pressure and coerce the Palestinians into submission. That was the approach, and that strategy has failed and will continue to fail unless you address the more softer consensual element. And that's, I think, a strategic misperception in Israel, that with strength and force you can submit others to your will in the region, but also the Palestinians. And I think this needs to be said more loudly by people here in the West in particular, who've been involved in counterinsurgency and know that this is not going to succeed. Israel has no strategy. It didn't have a strategy. It probably never had a strategy for the Palestinian question. And they now think that they have a tactical victory in Gaza, which is this peace deal and that outcome, but it's not a strategic one. And they need to realize that if they don't engage strategically and politically and solve this at the negotiation table, the insurgency will continue.
I want to thank all our guests, Mohammed Shehada, Andreas, Krieg and Ronnie Kasrils. And I want to thank you too as well for watching. Now, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And further discussion, let's go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.